Good evening and welcome. You're watching The Big Story on NDTV Profit and I'm Nupur Talwar Suri. Well, the meeting that has been much anticipated between the Indian Prime Minister Modi and the Premier of China, Xi Jinping, is taking place on the sidelines of the BRICS summit. Now, this considerable thaw in ties, of course, is being viewed as something that could reset ties between India and China. And it began right before the BRICS summit with an agreement being reached on long-standing patrolling issues that started after the Galwan clashes. But what it could mean is a change in the positions of both India and China globally, as well as bring about India's position as a global leader in solving conflicts. In fact, we have heard from S. Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister, about how there has been continuous work on between both the sides in order to resolve the conflicts that we saw on the ground. We listen into that conversation that we had with him, and thereafter we'll take you to the three big questions that we are asking today.
Various points of time, people almost gave up. You can say, you know, this has happened. So we have always maintained that, you know, on the one hand, we had to obviously do the counter deployments, but side by side, we have been negotiating. We've been negotiating in fact, since September of 2020.
All right. In fact, that has brought Indian diplomacy right at the center of the world stage. As we've heard before, Prime Minister Modi is equally welcomed in Russia as he is in Ukraine, and Indian diplomacy is being lauded. The three big questions that we are asking on The Big Story this evening. Number one, of course, is what does this breakthrough mean for relations between India and China? Number two, how is this historic meeting likely to impact global alignments? And question number three, of course, is India now poised to take global leadership position in conflict resolution? In fact, to answer all these questions, we are now joined by Ambassador Prabhu Dayal. He's a former diplomat. Good evening, Ambassador. Thank you very much for taking out the time to be with us on The Big Story. We are, of course, in the middle of that meeting that is taking place between Prime Minister and Xi Jinping on the sidelines, of course, of the BRICS summit. Now, do you think that this is going to bring about a reset in ties between the two countries, which have been, to say the least, been frosty since 2020?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on your show. The disengagement certainly has improved the atmosphere for the talks which are taking place just now at the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and the Chinese President Xi Jinping. So the improvement of the atmosphere and the preparation of the right sort of atmosphere were fundamentally required for having the summit meeting in the first place. Now, I've spoken to a number of defense analysts, and they are of the view that we have to wait and watch how the situation on the ground actually evolves. And perhaps that is the correct assessment, because the Chinese have, in the past, gained a reputation for rubbishing agreements whenever convenient. They have ignored agreements and done as they pleased, because of the fact that that is the way they are. Now, at the same time, a better relationship with India is perhaps being felt by they themselves as being in their interest, because the Chinese are facing certain economic issues. Their global trade has come down. They would stand to gain by having a better and a more normalized relationship with India. Now, of course, India has been an important trade partner for China, and China has been one of our top trading partners. And for instance, it has been a key supplier of a number of items which we need, such as raw materials for our pharmaceutical industry and items such as telecom hardware. So we want to have a better trade relationship, and this can only happen when the overall relationship is better. And certainly, what has taken place, this announcement relating to a disengagement, is very good. Of course, we have said that this is an agreement, but I understand that in the Chinese media, it is being referred to that the two sides have resolved to disengage. So there is a small difference. But let's see what happens on the ground. The important thing is what the army gives as a feedback to government, how much of this disengagement is taking place. You know, in these issues, there are 3 Ds which are very important: disengagement, de escalation, and demilitarization. We would very much want demilitarization. But for that to happen, there has to be first de escalation. But for that to happen, there has to be disengagement. So if the first step has actually taken place, it's a very good sign. You know, I may mention that disengagement had taken place at three critical areas, but it remained an impediment in the areas of Depsang and Denchak. And if patrolling arrangements are worked out, and if the disengagement actually takes place, then certainly the armed forces of India and the armed forces of China would be able to live together in a better situation. And I must say that it remains to be seen how things unfold.
Right.
But if this situation normalizes, then the overall relationship would be much better.
Absolutely. So as you're pointing out, of course, we'll have to wait and watch for how this actually pans out on the ground and the feedback that we get from the army. Good evening, Ms. Sikri. We are also now joined by the former High Commissioner, Ms. Veena Sikri, on the show. Your first thoughts on what's happened in the past few days. We've seen this disengagement happened. Today, of course, there was an important bilateral between Prime Minister Modi and Premier Xi Jinping. What do you make of it, and what do you see as the outcome of this? Do you think that there could be a reset in ties going forward?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to recognize that this very agreement, which was announced over the last 2 days, and even the response, the way it was announced in the Indian media and has received a very positive response, the way it was announced in the Chinese media by their Foreign Office spokesman in a much more cautious and careful way, and saying that we are going to work on implementation of the resolution. So the focus seems to be that there will be problems in the implementation. Regardless of all that, I would say that the fact that we have been able to reach this agreement after 31 meetings of the working committee, working mechanism on the coordination, after 21 committee meetings of the military level commanders, it is China which has blinked. I think we have to really look at the reasons why it happened like that. India has been very persistent, very consistent, and has not moved away from its stance that the bilateral relationship cannot proceed until we go back to the pre-Galwan, pre-2020 situation. And India has not only maintained this position, it has not blinked on this position, and it has backed it up by showing its military preparedness to remain where it is and to do the confrontation and to show that we can, as we did in Galwan. We know that so many Chinese soldiers also died in that occasion, which they have not even revealed. But we have backed it up by infrastructure development, by moving our forces, by moving our equipment, and showing that we have the capacity and the know-how to do it and to continue doing it. So I think that this has been a great factor that China has had to take on board, combined with the factor that their own economy is is really falling off the cliff, and they themselves are looking anxiously for stimulus, various stimuli that they can give to the economy, and also in the defense forces itself. The demographics of China are so bad that for them to maintain this presence of young soldiers who don't even want to join the army anymore at the strong level is in doubt. So that's one aspect we have to look at. Secondly, I think we have to look at the whole aspect of BRICS itself. I think China is looking for leadership in BRICS. India has made its position very clear that we see BRICS as not an anti-Western group, but a non-Western group. And I think we are prepared to develop BRICS and work with BRICS as strongly as, for example, we have been working with Quad on maritime security and other issues. This is a very important part of our multipolarity, our focus on multipolarity, our focus on multi-alignment, our focus on strategic autonomy. So I think that we have made it very clear, but it is clear that China is looking at it as their leadership. So there is going to be India looks at itself as a leadership of the global south. And we've seen how the virtual summits of the global south were held. We've seen how India's G20 chairmanship brought the African Union into the G20. So India has done itself very proud in its chairmanship and leadership of the global south. Does China see this as something that they're worried about? Does China want to muscle in on this? We know that China's own credibility in the global south has taken a big dip because of BRI having gone awry. And the BRI, even the flagship CPEC, the Chinese-Pakistan Economic Corridor, is not going anywhere. And many, many countries of the world are worried about the indebtedness that participation in the BRI has led to them. We've seen in Sri Lanka itself the indebtedness and the problem that China did not lift a little finger, help Sri Lanka. So I think in all of this tussle between India and China in the leadership of the global south is an important factor. I think India is doing very well in this because India respects the global institutions. We want a rule-based international order. We want the multipolarity to be reflected in all the international organizations, whether it's Bretton Woods, whether it's permanent membership of Security Council. There's a little conflict between India and China, for example, on permanent membership of the Security Council, definitely. But India has done very well. My point is that the very fact that China has blinked is a reflection of India having done very well over the last 10 years on the economy.
So, Ms. Sikri,
yes.
And Ambassador Dayal, both of you seem to agree that the fact that we are looking at what's happening right now is a lot of it is due to the fact that China could be going on a downward slide as far as its economy is concerned. Ambassador Dayal, what I wanted to ask you was, how do you see this in the context of the timing of what's happening right now? It's coming in at a time where we are seeing major upheavals in world politics. So how much of a driver do you think has this stabilizing, if I could use that word, of ties between these two Asian neighbors?
Well, timing is always extremely important. And this announcement that has taken place relating to the disengagement at the line of actual control has been very useful in the context of preparing the atmosphere for the talk between our Prime Minister and the Chinese President. So timing is the essence of the announcement itself. Because had there not been this announcement relating to the disengagement, maybe the bilateral meeting may not even have taken place. So the timing serves as a starting point. And in fact, the timing of the BRICS meeting itself is extremely important because the world is going through a crisis of various aspects. For instance, there is the Russia-Ukraine war, there is the Middle East war, there is a global economic crisis, there are things like the energy crisis, the climate-related issues. So it is important that countries like Russia, India, China, which are big global players, and also a number of countries of the Middle East, which are facing problems on account of the ongoing crisis, they stick together and see how a way could be found to iron out problems and difficulties and to reach solutions. Now, for instance, Iran is participating in the summit. Now, Iran is almost directly involved in the Middle East crisis. Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis are proxies of Iran. So, if Iran is there at the summit and in the bilateral engagements, we can impress on Iran to use its good offices to get its three proxies to scale down the activities which they are carrying out against Israel, then there is some hope of easing out the Middle East situation. So the bilateral interactions which could take place on the sidelines of this summit are very important. Similarly, the bilateral engagements which we would have, of course, with China and Russia would help in various respects too. For instance, with Russia, we have been pointing out that we believe that this is not an era of war. Prime Minister has said this to Putin a few times, and the fact seems to be registering, because Putin has now been on record as saying that he also wants the war to end, but he can't put a timeline on it. So he's certainly taken a step forward. So the timing of the BRICS summit itself is very important, as I said, because it comes in the context of so many major global crises. And as regards the announcement of the disengagement, as I said earlier, this is extremely important in terms of the timing, because it has facilitated the bilateral summit meeting between the two leaders.
All right. This, of course, also brings us to the third big question that we are going to be looking at today. Is now India now looking to play a larger role as far as conflict resolution is concerned? In fact, Ambassador Dayal, you did refer to it. But first, let's just quickly play out what was said by the External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar at the NDTV World Summit. He spoke about India's position as a global mediator.
Just look over the last 10 years. Right now, there is a war going on in Ukraine. How many countries, how many prime ministers, how many leaders have the ability to go to Moscow, talk frankly, go to Kiev, talk frankly, go back to Moscow and go back to Kiev? Similarly, there's another war going on in the Middle East. Now, not many people know that even in the last year, the number of times where actually we've had conversations with Iran and conversation with Israel, that's also there. True. We are today in the global south seen very much, okay, people trust us to stand for their interests.
And it was also the Bhutanese Prime Minister was also there for the NDTV World Summit. He spoke about the fact that everybody in the neighborhood seems to look up to India as the leader of the global south. Listen into this one.
Like I mentioned, the global south looks to India's leadership because they trust India's leadership. I mentioned about geopolitics and problems the world is facing, particularly in terms of war, and the effect that has throughout the world. If any country can sort it out, it is India. If any person that can sort out the problems between Russia and Ukraine, it is Prime Minister Modi.
Ms. Sikri, to you now. The question that would be playing on a lot of people's minds is that are we now finally in a position to take leadership in conflict resolution? And as the External Affairs Minister pointed it out, we've spoken, the Prime Minister in fact himself has taken a lot of interest in trying to sort out the situation between Ukraine and Russia. He's one of the few leaders who actually been welcomed on both sides. And not just that, even as far as the conflict that we are seeing in Israel with Lebanon as well as with other countries in that region, we've played quite an active role.
Well, I must say that as far as this issue of conflict resolution is concerned, it's not something that you can ask for. They say, oh, that India is going to mediate. Not at all. India has never shown any direct interest in mediation or in claiming this bigger role for itself. But I would say that we are seeing today that the world is giving this role to India more and more. And they are recognizing the leadership of Prime Minister Modi and his ability to develop these excellent person-to-person relationship with leaders like President Putin, President Zelensky, the President of Iran. And it is these very people who are involved in these conflict situations who are recognizing the potential for India's role in conflict mediation and in bringing the conflict to an end. So Prime Minister Putin, our Prime Minister, yes, he has met President Putin for the third time, in this very year. But it is President Putin yesterday who said after the bilateral meeting that he would welcome the role of India in any mediation. The President Putin did not say this about China. They did not say this about anybody else, but he has readily accepted that India should have this role. Similarly, when our Prime Minister had the bilateral with the President of Iran yesterday, it is the President of Iran who said that India can have this role. India should have this role. India has the ability, the capacity, the global recognition to have this role, the global trust to have this role. This is what I see as building up more and more over the last 1 year when the conflict situation has got worse and worse. But India's economy, India's leadership, the outcome of India's elections are strong and stable, that the world is recognizing that here is the potential where you have strong stability, strong development, strong leadership, and the ability to develop these person-to-person relationships, which makes a big difference in conflict mediation and in conflict resolution. So I think that this BRICS summit and our Prime Minister's presence, the presence of so many world leaders, the outcome of the bilaterals has shown this. And this is where India has said that it's ready to shoulder this responsibility if it should arise. We do not seek it, but we will shoulder it if everybody talks about it. And let's see where it goes from here. And let's see, I think everybody is waiting with bated breath for the outcome of the American election.
So Ms. Sikri,
yeah, yes.
You essentially believe that we've grown into this role and the stability that we see in India is perhaps a reason for this. We're very quickly going to play out a comment that came in from the Prime Minister where he talked about the fact that essentially if India succeeds, it's better for the world and everybody has their sights on India. He was, of course, speaking at the NDTV World conference.
दुनिया में मची उथल-पुथल के बीच भारत उम्मीद की एक किरण बना है। जब दुनिया चिंता में डूबी है, तब भारत आशा का संचार कर रहा है। और ऐसा नहीं कि ग्लोबल सिचुएशन से हमें फर्क नहीं पड़ता।
Right, Ambassador, as Ms. Sikri was pointing out, obviously we have reached this position, but what we are seeing today, is it also perhaps a symbol that we have now entered a phase where there is a multipolar world, and as that happens more and more, India's position is only going to be strengthened?
Yes, certainly. And one reason for that is that we believe in multi-alignments. We are not in any one particular grouping. So this allows us to have the potential to improve relations with, on the one hand, the Western countries like the United States, and at the same time with countries like Russia. Multi-alignment is essential for the sort of foreign policy that we have in mind. Now, I may also mention that President Putin has reportedly said that he thinks India, China, and Brazil are three countries which can help to negotiate peace in the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, that is a very important statement because trust is extremely essential when you are trying to bring about peace between warring factions or warring parties. And the fact that India is trusted by one of the combatants, Russia, is not insignificant. And it, of course, there are huge hurdles because there are fundamentally divergent positions which exist between Russia and Ukraine. And the Russian position is also antithetical to what the Western countries think. In fact, NATO countries are playing a bigger role in what is going on in this conflict than perhaps many people realize. The requirement is for dialogue and diplomacy, which of course entails give and take. And this is what our Prime Minister has been saying, that it's not the age of conflict, it's not the era of war. And what is needed is dialogue and diplomacy. And perhaps India's positioning as a global player and its belief in multi-alignments, multilateralism, can be very significant in this context.
Absolutely, Ambassador, as you're saying, it's not an age of war, but we seem to be entering more and more conflicts as time passes by. Veena Sikri, as well as Ambassador Dayal, both of you, thank you very much for joining us. And we will discuss what this means once we have the US elections around the corner. Ms. Sikri, you were referring to it, but perhaps at another time. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us. Well, that's a wrap on the big story this evening. Thank you for joining us, but do stay with us on NDTV Profit for more.